Hi, guys, and welcome back to the Female Fitness Podcast. I'm your host, Danny, and today I have the pleasure of being joined by Alessia, who is an online coach who helps support clients who are trying to conceive. And she is also on her own sort of journey as well, which I'm sure we'll delve into in a little bit more detail. So, Alessia, how long have you been coaching, and what made you want to get into sort of like this side of the industry?
Yeah, hello. I'm still a fairly new coach actually. So I only started coaching August 2021. I always had a really keen interest in nutrition, and did my nutrition qualification, my courses and everything quite a while ago now. I think like about probably 4 or 5 years ago. And like I said, just through my own personal interest. But because me and my husband started to try and conceive in 2020, I feel like the pandemic has just ruined all of our time management
Yeah.
or like our perception of time. So I keep having to think about when did things happen. But yeah, in 2020, yeah, basically we kind of struggled a little bit, and it kind of came up to like the year's mark, and we kind of looked into like ways to try and figure out what was going on basically, and kind of figured out some other bits as well around IVF and kind of genetic testing. I can go into more detail after a while, but basically like that then kind of got me thinking, okay, this would be my in maybe into the kind of coaching industry or fitness industry a little bit more, like to actually start my own coaching practice, just because I was told I would have to lose weight myself to be able to be eligible for IVF. And I think the advice that the consultant gave me was, why don't you start a crash diet or like a fad diet and just like lose quickly, basically. And he kind of, it was just a passing comment, but it actually just stuck so much with me that I thought, this is absolutely ridiculous that this advice would be given out. And I think especially like at least with my nutrition qualification and my coaching qualification, I knew not to take that advice, but I just kind of thought like, what kind of havoc can that cause like for other people? And you're so vulnerable in that situation anyway, like you're trying to conceive, things haven't gone well. And you would literally do anything at that point to try and
Yeah.
do something. And to be fair, I actually, not because of the consultant, but I think before we even looked at that, I did just think like, oh, maybe I should just try 1,200 calories and just see what happens. Maybe I can rack up enough discipline or whatever. But it just didn't, obviously it didn't work out. But yeah, so I think, but that really just kind of, like I said, I was always interested in the nutrition side of things and the kind of science and everything, but I think that really kind of just ignited like a passion, I think, inside me, that I thought, no, like if I can help this, then I would want to help this. And yeah, and that's how I ended up coaching basically.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I think there's a lot to be said for having been through a similar journey that your clients are going through,
Yeah.
or going through a similar journey to what your clients are going through, because obviously, like someone like myself, I could help
Mhm.
people technically, lose body fat to try and conceive, but
Yeah.
I've never been through that process myself.
Yeah.
And so I can't fully imagine what it would be like to be in their shoes, whereas you can, which is incredible.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks.
And
Yeah,
so,
absolutely.
yeah, and when what I was going to say as well is like you're so fortunate in that you had that education when that was suggested to you,
Mhm.
because like you said, there's so many people who just don't, and you're in such a vulnerable position.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I think it's really, yeah, I think that's why it just stuck with me so much. And I think there's so much conflicting information just generally around nutrition. And I think just like there's lots of people that say you need to do X, Y, and Z, to conceive, or, like proper, just what you would see in the fitness industry as well. Just generally just people trying to sell something that just isn't, that necessarily shouldn't necessarily be sold to anybody. I mean, it should be much more just like people that have no morals and no ethics, basically trying to just get people to do something. Um, so yeah, so I think it's really important that when then also health professionals kind of chime in and then give you like kind of like just really lazy advice, it just really doesn't help. Like I get it, the consultant, they look at research, they look at like 1,200 calories diet's working, for people in a research setting, but obviously it just doesn't really translate to the public, basically. So I think that's kind of the missing link. But I think to the person that attends, it just sounds like the same. It just sounds like people on Instagram advertising, hey, just do this 1,200 calorie diet and you'll be fine.
Yeah. And so if anyone listening to this sort of knows that they want to have children at some point, when should they really start thinking about preparing themselves for this so that they have the best possible chances of conceiving?
I mean, so I think ideally, probably before you would decide that you want to start, ideally you would kind of think about it a little bit ahead of time if that suits your life plan, I suppose. And also, like, maybe it's not really a plan, like maybe you don't really know what's happening, you just randomly decide, and like that's fine. But the reason I say it would be best to do it kind of like 3 months before you actually start, to try and conceive, is because the recommendation from the NHS is that people should take, or women should take, folic acid, for example. And that's really quite an important supplement because it prevents kind of like developmental issues of the fetus, especially kind of I forgot now what the actual term is, but basically like, yeah, like developmental issues and kind of neurological related issues, basically. And yeah, so I think the general recommendation is like if you can start taking folic acid 3 months ahead of you actually trying to conceive, then that kind of prepares you a little bit. But that's kind of like the bare minimum, I suppose. But as soon as you really decide to try and conceive, I think it's just, yeah, I think that's the best time then also to try and prepare for it and not kind of delay it, I suppose. And yeah, there's various considerations, but I just kind of, yeah, so I'd say like 3 months before. And then, but also if you don't, it's like, don't panic, just take folic acid. That's the main thing.
Yeah. And I suppose in a way, a lot of the things that you would do to give yourself the best possible chance of conceiving would have a beneficial impact on people's health anyway. And so
Yes.
if people can do that as a part of their lives, even if I suppose maybe they're in a position where they know they potentially want to have children one day, they're not really sure when, like the
Yeah.
things that you would do to improve your chances of that would have a positive impact on your health and your life, regardless of
Yeah.
whether you're going to try and conceive in the next few months or not.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the recommendations in general, like as beyond the folic acid, just nutritionally or in terms of lifestyles, are the things that we would generally recommend as coaches to our clients as well, or just generally for the general population. So I think absolutely. But I think also, I think the decision to try and conceive can be quite a tricky one. I think, kind of talking about my own experience, I think I was really excited, and I did actually have friends that tell me beforehand, look, it can take a little bit longer than what you expect. But I think still just being so in the mindset of like, we, like most of us, or I don't know what it's like with younger generations, but at least when I went to school, it was very much the kind of like, and you were told like if you had sex once unprotected, you're going to be pregnant immediately. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
so it was always this narrative of don't do it for absolutely understandable reasons. I totally get why that's really important. But obviously then, like, what, 20 years later, when you are then ready to conceive, and then you kind of still have this kind of underlying expectation that that's what's going to happen, then yeah, it can be really disappointing. So I think while it's really good to prepare, like in terms of nutrition and lifestyle, I think mentally, like kind of understanding that things might not necessarily go the way you might think it would go, is maybe also important.
Yeah, you're so right. Like it was exactly the same for me growing up. It's sort of like it's almost to some extent kind of fear mongering. Like, but like you said, I understand why. Like it's for a reason,
Mhm.
for a good
Yeah,
reason. But then it just sets you up in this mindset of thinking, as soon as I have unprotected sex, I'm going to get pregnant,
yeah,
which is
yeah.
obviously not the case.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, obviously there are also cases where it does
Yeah,
happen. So that's kind of the issue, isn't it? Like, like there are plenty of examples where people do, like where it does like happen accidentally or planned, whatever it is, and that's absolutely fine. That's great. And to be fair, the majority of people will probably not face issues as such. But even if we're talking, so for example, like the definition of infertility is that if it takes longer than 12 months to conceive. But 12 months already can be quite a long time. So we're talking it's only like 12 cycles if you have regular cycles to start off with. So that's one thing, I suppose. But it's not really like, it can be quite a long time if you're constantly like waiting for something to happen, or for that positive test. So even those 12 months, yeah, like I said, it can just be a bit of it can mess with your head, I suppose.
Yeah. And so we spoke about sort of preparing to conceive to improve your chances of that. What does this actually look like in practice from a nutrition perspective?
Yeah. So from a nutrition perspective, so there is no like specific diet or way of eating that guarantees pregnancy. And like there really isn't anything that, there's no pill or anything that anybody can take and they're gonna fall pregnant from that, basically. That's kind of like important to say. Um, Even though according to certain people on Instagram, spammers and scammers, they, like I said, they will try and sell you anything. But what's kind of the most recommended diet in terms of that can kind of support and protect fertility is the Mediterranean diet. And that's kind of the reason for that is because it promotes kind of eating quite low saturated fats and kind of focusing more on mono and polyunsaturated fats. So things like your olive oil, your cold pressed rapeseed oils, those kind of things, nuts, avocado, like all the kind of good fats, oily fish. Then also really key is lots of like variety and colorful vegetables and fruit, and like the more color the better, basically. And that really is important for like your antioxidants and also for your fiber. And fiber again as well, just focusing on whole grains and getting a lot of like good whole grains in you. So it'd be bread, yes, you're allowed to eat bread, it's absolutely fine. But bread and like pastas, rice, everything, and like I said, but also like grains like quinoa or different kind of colored rice, stuff like that is really important to get in. But I suppose as well, the Mediterranean diet is also quite good because it's not just about the actual kind of food or the food that you consume, but it's also kind of the way of eating. So kind of sharing your meal times with other people together, enjoying your food, like taking time to cook your food and kind of enjoy the process of making food and making food that actually tastes nice to you. And yeah, like I do understand there's kind of certain barriers to that, day to day, nobody or most people don't have a lot of time to like stand in the kitchen for 2 hours, but there's lots you can do and try and different, like I said, just adding variety to your food to make it kind of delicious and tasty. So I think that's really important.
Yeah. And what are the recommendations around caffeine? Because I know that a lot of people listening to this podcast probably do
Yeah,
like caffeine. A lot of people in our industry definitely do.
true.
So what are the recommendations around that?
That's true. To be fair, I always just bang on so much about eating vegetables because I feel like nobody eats enough vegetables. So
Yeah.
that's always like my go-to line. But yes, absolutely, caffeine is quite important. So, um, caffeine, like ideally to reduce it to no more than 200 milligrams a day. And that is kind of probably like 1 to 2 cups of coffee, depending on how you make your coffee. So I suppose it's kind of a little bit hard to judge, but also just to take into account that obviously things like chocolate or caffeine, like tea, unless you drink decaf tea, all of these kind of things include caffeine as well. So if you already have a cup and then you also eat chocolate and maybe have a cup of tea later, like that's really you, for the day. So that's just something to take into consideration. That's not just coffee or tea, but there is other foods as well.
Yeah. And do you know actually why that is, like what the sort of like link to caffeine and fertility is?
I'm not actually, so I think in terms of fertility, I'm not really sure, to be quite honest. I don't know what exactly it does in the body. I think in terms of pregnancy, I think it can create kind of developmental issues with the child. But I think a lot of the recommendations, as far as I know, kind of lead into pregnancy. So a lot of the fertility recommendations have more to do with what it can then do actually once you are pregnant and how it can affect that. And that's the same kind of a body weight as well. So I wonder if the link is kind of to do with that. I could imagine that caffeine can maybe have a like also an impact in terms of just like the development of the actual egg or sperm cells, for example. But again, like I think some of the research that is a lot of the like a lot of what it is in terms of the nutrition research, I think for fertility is quite still mechanistic, I think, in a way. And a lot of it is not necessarily, okay, if you do this, then like I said, you'll definitely fall pregnant, or you know something different happens. I think it's all about reducing risk of things happening rather than like causation, like X leads to Y, if that makes sense. So similar, like I said, with caffeine, I think there is a, to be fair, I think there's probably studies that tell you that perfectly fine in higher dosage. But like I said, the general recommendation is to stay below 200 milligrams. And because, you know, like mostly that is quite easy for people to achieve, maybe after a time of adjustment.
Yeah, after they've gotten used to it,
Yeah.
after the initial like grace period where you might
Yes.
feel
Yeah.
a little bit lethargic.
Mhm.
And so when it comes to alcohol, what are the recommendations from that perspective?
Again, alcohol is again a tricky one because there isn't anything exactly saying like if you drink X amount of alcohol, you're definitely not going to be able to conceive, or you know, or it's definitely going to have a huge impact on your fertility. For men, I know that in terms of sperm quality, so if we want to think about the development of sperm, that binge drinking is definitely not recommended. And the same for women, to be fair as well, but like the way I've seen it is kind of usually more linked to sperm. But I think the general recommendation again is that, you know, you should stick to kind of like having like a couple of drinks here and there rather than going out and having like multiple drinks in one sitting. Um, as part of the Mediterranean diet, glasses of wine are allowed. So so that is kind of part of it as well. But like I said, the sometimes it's a little bit boring, the recommendations for fertility, because they're just not really that sexy. They're not really like, hey, like just cut all of this out and you'll be fine. Or they're not really like exciting, but it really comes down to kind of like finding a balance rather than taking anything to an extreme. I think that is really the what it's like for fertility and going then also into pregnancy, basically.
Yeah. And in a way, it's a good thing that the recommendations aren't extreme, because
Mhm.
then obviously it's much more realistic for people to make lifestyle changes and be able
Yeah.
to improve their chances of conceiving without developing like disordered eating habits, for example. So it's kind of a good thing in
Yeah.
a way. And that's not to mention, you know, the fact that people recommend that you follow a 1,200 calorie diet per day.
Yeah.
That's a different
Yes.
matter, but the
Yeah.
fact that the actual evidence-based recommendations are sort of simple lifestyle changes is a good thing in
Yeah.
practice, really.
Absolutely. No, I totally agree. I just sometimes find in terms of to get people to actually then establish or to get, I think what I find with people is that when they see that, they kind of just think like, oh, but that's just, well, that's just general healthy life. And kind of like, it just doesn't seem to like motivate anybody enough to really want to pursue that, or they think it's not extreme enough. They think they need to do something more because, you know, if it were, because they kind of feel like, oh well, if I just eat more broccoli, like how is that going to change anything? But yeah, so I think, yeah, I totally understand what you mean. Like in from a coaching perspective, it's great that these are the kind of recommendations, I suppose. But I think from an individual perspective, I think what I find is like people are a bit kind of like, yeah, but that can't just be all of it. Like surely I need to do something more extreme.
Yeah, I hear you on that. Like it's very similar to, obviously, if you're trying to persuade a client to go about fat loss in a more sustainable way, and they're
Mhm.
often quite tempted to buy into like quick fixes or
Yeah,
transformation challenges because they look more extreme and they're
yeah,
going to promise like drastic changes. So
yeah,
it's a similar sort of like thing in a way.
yeah,
And again, it's just like trying to, I suppose, coming at it from the standpoint of like, no, this is evidence-based, like this has been
mhm,
proven, and this
yeah,
is what's going to actually also keep your relationship with food intact and
yeah,
result in a healthier mind as well as like a healthier body.
yeah,
um and
yeah.
what should people think about from a lifestyle and training perspective when they're trying to improve their chances of conceiving?
So I think just again, like I think it just goes in line with the general. Well, I suppose when it comes to training and movement, I think you kind of need to start with wherever they are at just now. I think there's no point in like starting something major when you know when you currently just walk 2,000 steps, I suppose, every day. So I think it's about kind of finding something that you like doing and just moving your body on a regular basis as much as you can. If it's obviously if it's to do with that you're also trying to lose weight, then I think kind of looking at like, you know, kind of increasing just daily movement is quite important. But I think on the other aspect, because sorry, my brain always automatically jumps to kind of reducing weight because my main clientele is people that have a BMI of above 30. But obviously, we do also need to take to consideration like people whose BMI are maybe quite a lot lower, who are maybe overtraining, or training too much, not taking in enough calories, etc. And obviously, for those people, like there could be fertility issues just in terms of like losing their periods or having irregular periods for that matter. So sometimes it might actually be not so much about increasing movement or training, but it might actually be about reducing and making sure that like the impact on kind of like the menstrual cycle is kind of fixed in that way. So just to say, like, because I'm not a PT, so I can't really specifically say like here's like what exactly you should do with your training, but it's just more about like trying to find a balance and more and trying to like moderate your training, I suppose, in some respects, so that you don't overtrain, so that it doesn't impact um on your periods. And I suppose to give your body like the chance to kind of focus on, like I said, like egg development, sperm development, to kind of have resources in that area.
Yeah. Is there any, out of interest, I don't know if you'll know the answer to this, is there any specific styles of training that are recommended or recommended that you steer away from?
Um, it really depends. So, for example, there are some studies for people that suffer with PCOS, for example. I think where HIIT training has actually been quite beneficial to them. But again, I think so for the people that I tend to work with, I suppose a lot of them aren't necessarily into like regular training, or some of them have never even tried weightlifting or anything before. So I think to those people, I say just try something and try and find something that you actually like and that you will enjoy. Whereas I think for people who are kind of already in a regular exercise regime, again, like it's just about moving and being there. But yeah, I think if it's about overtraining, then obviously HIIT training, definitely not, because that is just a bit too much about reducing. But I'm not aware that there is any like particular style of training that you should avoid. Again, I think when it comes to then actually being pregnant, that might be a different thing, just in
Yeah.
terms of like, body considerations. But in general, no, not that I'm aware of, no.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I know that like even through and this is obviously from my own sort of like knowledge and research, I know that through the beginning stages of pregnancy, nothing really needs to change from a training
Mhm.
perspective, and it can actually help obviously support your mental
Yeah,
and physical well-being and the
yeah.
process as a whole. So like I know that no drastic changes are needed from that perspective. And I suppose when it comes to preparing your body to conceive, it mostly probably comes down to managing stress and making sure that your
Mhm.
training is realistic alongside your lifestyle, and making sure
Yeah,
that you've got enough fuel coming in to support the
yeah,
training that you're doing, and that
yeah.
it's not excessive, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. No, absolutely. And I think actually today I saw a post, actually. I think it was I think there was like there is actually more evidence coming out. I think that, even if you were to start training in pregnancy, like that is still fine. I think it's just all kind of just needs to be managed on an individual basis. So absolutely. I think in general, I think just trying to find a routine with your exercise, and if that's what you used to, then that's fine during your fertility absolutely phase, as long as you make sure you still eat enough.
Yeah, and obviously that you have a regular cycle, and if training is
Yes,
interfering with that, then it's something that potentially needs to
yes,
be stripped back. um
absolutely.
And I think this is an interesting question, because I am going to sort of disclaimer this by saying that supplements are only ever like the icing on the cake.
Hmm.
When
Yeah,
I think, especially when it comes to fertility, they're really sort of pushed to
yeah,
sell programs and to sell coaching services.
yeah,
So,
yeah.
are there any supplements that we can take
Hmm.
to help improve our chances of conceiving that are legitimate?
Yeah. I think so. In terms of that are legitimate, it really probably is only folic acid. Like I think that is probably the most well researched supplement to take. And like I said, that is definitely recommended by the NHS. I think I see more and more recommendations in terms of NHS that also talk about vitamin D, for example, which is also important. But then again, that is more like a public health recommendation in general, especially for people in the UK. Now that we've gone into autumn and winter, and vitamin D in general, well-researched supplement, like, you know, nothing bad is going to happen if you take that. It's going to be beneficial. But like taking like a general like multivitamin like for preconception is useful as well, because it does just add, yeah, it just gives you like a little bit of the extra levels. But like you said, supplements are always the icing on the cake. I don't want to say there's no point, because they obviously, like, your levels will be increased, so it is good, but there isn't really much point in taking and spending loads of money and loads of supplements if you barely eat two vegetables, basically, or just, you know, like, just don't really have a lot of variety, of you've not even like tried to improve your diet. So like, it sounds harsh, but it is the reality. So it's kind of just like, instead of kind of spending money on that, it's probably better like looking at, yeah, like, how can you kind of improve your shopping list? How can you improve your kind of food game or meal game, I suppose, to just eat better overall day to day, and that will have a really significant impact overall before you can then look at supplementation. In general, though, to be fair, the multivitamins, like the preconception ones, are kind of more affordable. Like, you can get them kind of just in most shops, to be quite honest. So it definitely doesn't harm. And I think that's, in general, that's probably also what most kind of, if you then go down the fertility clinic route or GPs, like, that they would recommend that somebody takes. The multivitamin usually, then the preconception multivitamin usually already has the recommended dosage of folic acid in that already. So that's something just to consider, that you don't double up. However, for people who have a BMI of 30 or above, they might actually require a higher dosage of folic acid, and sometimes a GP will then prescribe a 5 milligram dosage of folic acid. So it's worth looking, if you have a higher BMI, going to your GP to discuss whether you should be on a higher dosage of folic acid. So that's quite important. Yeah. So, but yeah, preconception multivitamin mostly. There are other considerations for supplementation. However, that is more for further down the line, like if there are already established fertility issues, or, you know, obviously if you have PCOS, there might be certain considerations, or even endometriosis, or, like I said, if there's like some sort of a diagnosis in play, then that might be different. But I think you definitely need to speak to your GP, and, or, you know, if a fertility clinic is involved, like, to them to kind of get recommendations.
Yeah, I know inositol is one of the
Mhm.
sort of like recommendations for PCOS. Is that something that you have sort of like read much into?
Yeah, like, I am aware that it can help, but I think there's probably quite a few different kind of things that people depend on taking, depending what they are taking. So it can be inositol, or it can be what's called enopholic alpha. So that's like inositol together with folic acid, because some of the absorption can be better. So again, like, I think just depends on what, it is very individual, I think, when it comes to that. And I think it just depends on what else you're taking as well, because there might be other things, like, people with PCOS might already be taking metformin, or kind of other kind of like ovulation induction, like helping, like, kind of tablets, or like medication in relation to that as well. So I would always err on the side of caution, kind of say, go and speak to your GP in the first place.
Yeah, definitely. And obviously supplements as well, they can become so expensive if you have like a massive
Yeah,
shopping list of stuff.
yeah,
And like you've identified, the things that are going to have such like a profound impact are our lifestyle factors. And if
hmm,
someone goes from consuming like no fruit and veg to having fruit or
yeah,
veg with each meal, for example, it's going to have such significant impact. And so it's not really worth considering things like supplementation until you've
yeah.
addressed those lifestyle factors.
Yeah, absolutely. And to be fair, there is some research to say, for example, when we're talking about omega-3s, so what we're getting from like oily fish, for example, omega-3 from oily fish is better used in our bodies if you eat it directly from the source. So if you eat it directly from the fish, as opposed to supplementing omega-3. Obviously, like, people who are vegetarian or vegan, eating the fish is not an option. That's absolutely fine. And you can take like an algae supplement, which is absolutely fine. But like I said, like, food does come first. It is, except for folic acid. That's different.
Yeah, that's the one that people. And if someone does want to supplement with folic acid, is there somewhere that they should look to get it?
You can literally buy it anywhere. So folic acid is actually the synthetic form of folate. So folate is what actually occurs in foods. So it's like green leafy vegetables, some like grains like bread, folic acid. Some of it, I think our flour, I don't know if it's already happened, but I think, is it the UK and the EU or either of them have actually agreed to supplement bread flour and pasta flour, for everybody, basically for the whole population, with like a small amount of folic acid, just to kind of help prevent like developmental issues in like unplanned pregnancies, for example. And that's quite common already. For example, it already happens in Australia. But yeah, that was just a side note. But yeah, so folic acid is the synthetic, like lab made form basically of folate, and we can't really get the kind of right amounts of folate from the diet. So that's why folic acid is produced. But you can buy it anywhere, literally. You can get a little tub in Tesco, Boots, like Sainsbury's, usually anywhere. It's really like readily available. Or if you can also go to your GP and get it prescribed, I think, especially if there's like financial issues.
And is there a certain dose that people should be looking to start taking, or should they be a bit more specific with that?
So it's like 400 units basically. I think most of the folic acid supplements that I've ever come across come in the right dosage already, and it usually has like a pregnancy sticker or something like that on it already as well, just for it to be identified. It's basically like a B vitamin as well. So I think it depends, but it will be like written on the box as folic acid, so it is really quite easy to identify. And even on the preconception multivitamins, there's like a whole list of vitamins that you can read, and again, you'll be able to identify folic acid quite easily.
That's perfect. And there's sort of a common message that's put out that our fertility sort of drops off a cliff at a certain age. Does our fertility decline as we age? And if so, to what extent? And is there anything that we can do about it?
So it doesn't drop off a cliff. So it's not immediately just when a woman turns 35 that immediately she's like she can't conceive anymore. It's not really like that. However, it is also important to recognize that fertility does decline over time, which then means that trying to conceive can take longer. And longer than, for example, 12 months, or longer than even 2 years sometimes, depending on the age. And I think that is really not discussed often enough, I suppose. And it's become more common, I suppose, or one of the reasons why infertility is becoming more common just in general across the population is because people tend to trying to conceive a lot later in life. Even just being financially stable and all these kind of things couples tend to want to have in place. So it just takes a little bit longer before somebody actually decides to try to conceive. We can't unfortunately do anything about the aging process. That is just something that happens. Sure, like I said, like lifestyle factors, nutrition factors, I think, like I said, the research around it, I think, is still quite mechanistically. So I don't know what will happen, but I think there's a lot of people that are interested to try and find out more about, how fertility can be preserved. Because it is definitely an important topic, like I said, because infertility is on the rise and the kind of general populations are kind of declining. And while maybe for the environment that might not be a bad thing, but just in general, I suppose for countries, economies, etc., they obviously want more people, I would imagine. So I think there are kind of like huge like think tanks and research groups going on to try and kind of figure this out. But yeah, unfortunately, we can't really do anything in terms of aging. The kind of nutritional and lifestyle factors can be somewhat protective of fertility, but there's just no guarantee, because we're really talking about, like damaging, like the aging part is kind of damage to the DNA of like an egg cell or a sperm cell. So there's, unfortunately, at the moment, we don't really know how to fix that.
Yeah. And I suppose it's probably becoming more of an issue because people are doing things much later now. Like people are retiring much later in life, for example.
Yeah.
And that process is having a big impact on when people start trying for children. Like people used to have children so much earlier, like early 20s, whereas now that's like it's much less common. And so I guess that's part of the issue there. And there are obviously options like egg freezing, but then again, they are very expensive in a lot of circumstances.
Yes, absolutely. I think long term, I think something that will need to happen, I suppose, if you want to encourage younger people to think about, kind of they trying to conceive journeys or just in general about fertility and all these things, then yeah, I think they will have to kind of make some sort of offers, I suppose, to 20-year-olds or something to kind of get them into, freeze their eggs. But then I suppose there's also an argument of whether egg freezing is that useful, I suppose, because I think in general the consensus is that freezing embryos tends to be better. Like I think the um, freezing an embryo and then using that embryo is can ends up in more live births basically, or successful pregnancies basically. Um, so, freezing your eggs in your 20s, I suppose, is still no guarantee that you're actually going to then have a child whenever, you get to that. And I think wrapping your head around all these things, it just becomes such a big thing. It's no longer then just like, oh, I'm just going to freeze my eggs. But then suddenly you're thinking about, oh, but then what if I don't have a child? Or like, it's just kind of just it spirals down into lots of conversation. So, but yeah, but I think at the moment that's kind of what's available to us. So I think for anybody listening who was maybe thought about this already and isn't quite sure about it, I think it's definitely worth looking into for everybody because that is what's available to us. And I think just generally considering the topic of fertility and egg freezing, or just how it might go for you in later life, is quite important at this stage.
Yeah, I suppose it is so hard because like when you're obviously in your early 20s,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of people won't even know whether they want children or not. So then
Yeah,
they're not thinking about egg freezing. But
yeah,
and especially with, like I said, the financial investment that comes with it, I think
mm-hmm.
if it was something that cost very minimal money, more people would do it because they think like,
Yeah,
why not? But with the financial investment of it, it's like unless someone is 100% certain that they definitely want children, then
yeah.
they're probably not even going to consider it.
That's true. Yeah. And I think long term, yeah, I think it's probably more like I don't know if it will ever become like a public health thing or something, but I suppose they will have to, it's like the NHS would probably have to think about what is on offer. Cause I'm just thinking already like fertility clinics, I would say are struggling with, dealing with people who have gotten to the stage of infertility who now need IVF. And like the backlog is huge. I mean, the waiting times are kind of, if you go through the NHS, are well, like kind of to a year to probably even longer sometimes. So I think there's already like a bottleneck of like kind of
Yeah,
30 something year olds, all needing fertility treatment, when it's kind of like maybe they need to think about what can we do for,
to
like
prevent
before
that.
that, and yeah, and like put the funding into maybe supporting people into egg freezing, and like offer kind of schemes for that so it becomes more affordable maybe at that stage. I don't know, but that's
Yeah,
just what I think in my head.
definitely. And I think a really important question that I wanted to ask you, because I do have a lot of like coaches that listen to this
Mhm,
podcast and personal trainers.
mhm.
If we have clients or if someone themselves is trying to conceive, how can we best support ourselves or our clients if we go through times where we're unsuccessful?
Yeah. Do you mean unsuccessful in terms of it hasn't, like trying to conceive isn't going the way you
Yeah,
wanted
so
to go?
if they're
Yeah.
struggling getting pregnant in the first place.
Yeah. Okay. Um, so I think in general, and I know we've already spoken quite a lot about nutritional things, but and like I said, like nothing can unfortunately guarantee pregnancy, but we can certainly kind of try and do our best to try and protect it or support it. And I think focusing really on like nutritional gaps and making sure that somebody eats, like I know I keep banging on about vegetables, but just making sure like, that you have a complete nutritional profile in your diet and all these things is actually so important. And I think sometimes maybe when people come to us with weight loss, it's just like, okay, well, we'll just look at calories and that's fine. I don't really care what else you eat, kind of thing. Not that that's how everybody does it. Obviously, we all try and promote a healthy lifestyle, but I think maybe sometimes it's maybe easy to be a bit more lenient with people to kind of say as long as you're within your calorie deficit and you're losing weight, you're doing great. But I think really to kind of hone in more into the messaging that yes, you can have a takeaway, yes, you can, eat sweets or you can have some chocolate, but it does need to be moderated. You do need to make space for, proper decent meals of protein, vegetables, and kind of like I said, your whole grains, and that is kind of important. and yeah, it's maybe like a bit boring, and maybe that's why, yeah, it's like I said, it's kind of hard to adopt, I suppose, but I think that's really quite important to make sure, because even if it's not just for fertility, and like a lot of the recommendations in the fertility world, it is really about creating an environment where a pregnancy can thrive, and then eventually also, you're talking, like I said, about child development. There's lots of research of how our diet as parents impacts then how our children eat as well. And also just to speak about, like, modeling behaviors obviously as well, so if maybe um there's like emotional eating, like the parent like suffers with emotional eating, or trying to conceive, you suffer with emotional eating, or even disordered eating, like that's the time now to kind of like address those things, I suppose, to help with that, so that it can get better. But I think specifically when things aren't really going the way, yeah, like that you expect it to be, or it's becoming a lot more, yeah, kind of tougher, really hard. I think emotional management is really important, like kind of learning to identify your emotions, to sit with them, to kind of like um yeah, to kind of not be so reactive to them, I suppose, because I think you're going through so much, kind of like building up hope, and then kind of just being disappointed kind of every month. Um, I suppose you're kind of forced to get used to that after a while, but I think just being able to deal with that, and just still kind of recognize that, yes, this is one part of my life that is happening right now, but I have all these other things going on as well that I may be more positive, and really kind of trying to find joy in other aspects of life, I think is really important, as for the individual, but I think also maybe from a coaching perspective to hone in on that with clients, that it's not just all about trying to conceive. While there will be days in the month where the client will want to focus specifically on that, and they just want to like sit and eat a tub of ice cream and cry, that's fine. But then the rest of the time, to really kind of remind them of all the other things that are going so well for them, or to encourage them to think about things, other things that they can adopt. I just said to somebody else a couple of days ago, I'm just like, so think about, what are your hobbies, like what do you want to focus on, can you start something new? Is there something that you always wanted to start? Is there something you can really get your teeth stuck in? Would highly recommend starting a business. That's what I did last year. And that certainly has helped me. So
Yeah.
if you're a coach listening to this, maybe you have a new service that you want to offer. You need to
Yeah,
get your teeth stuck in.
definitely. But no, I think you've made really, really good points there. And it's like each week, when a client checks in with me, I'll always get them to start with something that has gone well that week, because despite everything that's going on, if there's things that's gone wrong in a certain week,
Mhm.
or things that haven't gone as well as you might have hoped, there's always something to be taken from each
Mhm.
week, like a lesson or something that you've achieved that you should be proud of.
Yeah.
And I think zooming out is really helpful when you're going through difficult times.
Yeah, absolutely. I think another thing I would say is also just to not suffer in silence. And I
Yeah.
think maybe especially as somebody who like already knew, or had gone through, like obviously my nutrition qualification, all these things, like I still went to, like, I don't know, different places in my head, like I said, where I then considered and thought, oh, I'll just do a 1,200 calorie diet and see what happens, or maybe I can just do this quickly, or you start to question quite a lot of it. Like I think there's this rational side of you who, as like the coach, and like I said, you have all your qualifications and your knowledge, but that doesn't always protect you then from your emotional side, and the vulnerability that you feel already in being in that stage, and like the maybe like the thoughts of like failure that might come up, or that you think that you're a failure, or just the things like, oh, I can't give my partner a child, like all these kind of things might come up with emotions. And also, like, I keep talking, I suppose, more from the female perspective, but also from the male perspective, there's obviously male factor infertility as well, or just from the male perspective as well, that to kind of stereotype, I suppose, a little bit, but as in my experience, I do find that men aren't as forthcoming, like, and don't want to talk as much about these kind of things. And I think especially that can be quite difficult, if we're talking about like masculinity, and not being able to father a child. So I think it can really bring up quite deep and sometimes dark thoughts, I suppose. So I think it's about kind of being aware of that a little bit as well, and just to not suffer in silence, and to recognize it, and to ask for help when you need it. Um, let it be to speak to your GP and advocate that you want some help with this, or trying to kind of find out, like seek out the communities that kind of exist online that talk a bit more about fertility, trying to conceive, etc.
Yeah. Are there any tools that you use with clients to help encourage them to feel their feelings and emotions and deal with them?
So I think to start off with, I think I kind of have a chat with them at the beginning about just generally, just to kind of get to know them and understand how they would deal with situations, I suppose. And I think usually when it comes to dealing with their emotions, I think is a lot of it is connected to also the eating habits. So I think that's usually the way in that I find is because we're talking about emotional eating and about how to kind of deal with like the emotional eating side of things. So just trying to find other ways to cope with your feelings in the moment. And I feel like that these are then also practices that they are able to then use just generally in life, I suppose. So for me to tell them about, so I think, like, for example, often I have clients who are coming home from like work and they're like mega stressed, for example, and then they immediately just in the cupboard and just want to eat absolutely everything. But just finding other ways to relax, for example, in that moment and to cope with the stress. So taking a bath, going for a walk, like, and just having like a list like ready of things that they can kind of do or they can refer to on their phone or notebook, or just have it like next to the door, basically, if it's a common thing, for example. I feel like that's really helpful for them. But also using like the feelings wheel. I don't actually know if that's like a the term for it, but I just know that that's what the picture looks like. It's kind of like this big wheel and it has like lots of kind of words to describe all the different emotions or feelings that have been identified. Um, and just kind of, because I do get people who are just like, oh, but I don't really know what it is, or like I don't know how I feel, or and just being able to name that emotion, I think, can be quite freeing quite often. So that's another like kind of tool that I use for people to yeah, just to understand their feelings better in the first place as well.
Yeah. Do you ever use tools like journaling as well with your clients?
Yeah, it depends. I think I think that's more a little bit like comes from me though as well, because well, it depends. If they are open to it, absolutely. If they're open to it, absolutely. But I also have people, or including myself, I think. I don't know if it's because you kind of attract like people as your clients that are similar to you.
Yeah.
But I think sometimes I struggle with journaling. So I don't know if like for that reason I've not actually like advised people to do it too much, I
Yeah.
suppose. I've had one client who was really into it and who found it really useful, and like I said, that's absolutely fine, that's great. But yeah, I don't know. I feel like other clients have kind of come to me and been like, yeah, I'm not really into this. And I'm like, okay.
Yeah, I hear you. I hear you. And it just goes to show like there's no one size fits all, because some people,
Yeah,
like you said, you've got the client who absolutely loves it and finds it
yeah,
beneficial, but then there's yourself and like your other clients who
yeah,
just don't get on with it so well.
yeah.
And we're all different.
Yeah, absolutely. I find as well when I suppose like when I'm just thinking about it, I think especially in the community, like the kind of fertility, infertility community online, like on Instagram, I think a lot of people actually have anonymous Instagram accounts and probably almost use that as a journal. So that, so when I'm saying journal, I'm kind of thinking of like sitting down with a book and I'm writing something in it. But I suppose I find like a lot of people share quite a lot, like I said, just online or on Instagram, and that's probably like how I interact with quite a lot of people. So maybe that's why I get clients who are then like, yeah, I'm not really into writing in a book, but I kind of just use my Instagram account for it.
Yeah, I get that. And
Mhm.
you mentioned about infertility earlier and sort of the definition of that. Would you mind just defining that again? And also, how common is it?
Mhm. So infidelity, like according to the World Health Organization, is like a disease, like they do call it a disease, and it's about the failure to conceive within 12 months, which I just, yeah, I do take a little bit of issue with it because it just sounds so harsh. Like, yes, infertility can absolutely be a disease for somebody who has a specific diagnosis, and I think it can maybe give them relief to call it as such, because I think sometimes I think people feel quite misunderstood maybe in the infertility community, and or it takes such a long time for them to get a diagnosis, like especially if we're talking PCOS or even endometriosis as well. You know, a lot of people can sometimes wait years and years to finally get that diagnosis. So I think for them it's quite useful that it's, I suppose, called a disease in that way, and that it should be supported as such. Talking about things like how support and work and all these kind of things. But I suppose there's also a category called unexplained infertility. And that is basically you've gone through all the tests, there's nothing obvious to say that you have anything or that should be preventing you from conceiving, and there isn't really else that anybody can really do anymore or tell you what else to do, I suppose. So yeah, and then it just becomes a bit odd to call it a disease, I suppose, because for some people it just genuinely takes longer than 12 months to conceive, and then maybe in the second year they will conceive, or maybe in the third year they will conceive. But by that time you're probably already so stigmatized by the whole process and just so like in it. But yeah, so that's the definition of it. And then how common it is. So in the UK, it's about 1 in 7 couples that are affected by it. So that is just talking, obviously. I don't actually know if that. No, I think that just includes heterosexual couples, though.
Yeah.
So obviously, you're still talking about. So it's not. We're not talking individuals at that point. So I think the figure that the most recent figure that I've seen that it affects 3.5 million people. So individual people in the UK, which is actually quite a lot, I suppose.
Yeah.
But that will also include, so obviously people like it might be lesbian couples, for example, they tend to access IVF because that's the only way for them to conceive, or not just IVF, but could be IUI first as well, and then IVF. But it might be then that through that process they might find out that somebody like has infertility or struggling with infertility, but it also could be single parents, I suppose, as well, a single mother specifically going through the IVF process to have a child. Again, through that they might find out that they struggle with infertility. So 1 in 7 couples, but 3.5 million people, I suppose.
Yeah, I think it's a lot more common than people almost think at first. Like you don't, I suppose you don't really, like you said, you don't really think it's going to be an issue. You almost expect it not to be an issue. You expect it to happen when you want to have children. And I think in a way it's kind of reassuring for people to hear that it is a little bit more common than people might expect, so that when people are having these issues, they know that they're not alone, and they know that there's other people going through this process. And it can be very comforting to know that, and to know that there's support out there and there's a network of people that are going through similar struggles.
Yeah, absolutely. I think my only point, or why I kind of say about that there's a definition for it, or that if you haven't conceived within 12 months you are considered as infertile. Like the only thing I say about it is just like, because I think it is sometimes just quite common to take time to conceive, and while it is hard to kind of wrap a head around it, and I don't really want to take away from the emotional toll that the whole journey brings with it, but I suppose if we were just told that it can just take time, then maybe it wouldn't be as emotionally draining. Or you would kind of already maybe expect that, okay, we'll just see what happens in the first year. And yeah, of course, you will still have moments where you think, oh, for goodness sake, why, another negative pregnancy test or something like that. But your expectations might be completely different if you already know, okay, let's just see how this goes for the next year or two or whatever, rather than thinking, this should work within the next, 2 months or something like that. So, yeah, I think that's the kind of the one thing where I think, it's a bit unfortunate that the definition is so harsh, like it's so cutthroat. Like if you've taken 13 months, you're infertile.
Yeah, exactly. I know it's one of them things, isn't it? Like, and like you said, it should be almost in education when we're first taught about getting pregnant and we're first taught about sex. It should be that we're not set this unrealistic expectation that it's just going to happen straight away, and instead we're educated on yes, why it's important to use protection and all of that, but also it might not happen straight away if you do
Yeah.
have sex, and it
Yeah.
might be that you have to be patient, and that's okay. It doesn't mean
Yeah.
that you're like abnormal.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's what it is, because you don't, I think it's so easy to think that something is wrong with you, when maybe at the moment, and maybe in 10 or 20, 50 years time, maybe research will evolve and we'll figure out why it takes longer for some people to conceive and whatnot. It doesn't necessarily mean, there's anything wrong with us, but I suppose the way I understand it as well, that just not every egg cell or every sperm cell is genetically made up to be a human, or if they then meet and fertilize, and not every embryo is made up to become, like I said, a human, because just genetically there might be something wrong. And it's almost like, and it is the body kind of saying like, no, this is not right. And I don't want to like take the again, I'm not trying to like rationalize miscarriage or anything like that with that, but I think just understanding that sometimes on a genetic level, like, this is what happens, and that's how, you know the pregnancy test is negative, or maybe miscarriages will happen, is the body saying like, no, something is not right. We can't grow a human here. Like, it's not working. And like I said, I'm absolutely not trying to rationalize or justify, like, I'm not trying to take the emotion out of miscarriage or anything, but I think having the expectation of that is quite common, and that this is maybe a natural process, can maybe just help a little bit with the expectation of the whole
Yeah.
journey.
And just being able to rationalize things is really reassuring,
Yeah, I
on like a
suppose. Yeah.
scientific level, as opposed to
Yeah.
like you said, thinking what is wrong with me, and
Yeah.
like identifying as something being wrong with you, because that's never
Yeah.
helpful.
No.
And if someone is struggling, what are the options available for having children, and what do they look like?
Mhm. So usually, if after like a couple has tried for 12 months, for example, they would go and see their GP. Most likely that's kind of the starting point to kind of understand, what's going on, and they would recommend certain testing. So I think for women, it would have to be like a testing at different stages of the cycle to understand if the kind of hormones are kind of all going the way they should be, basically. And then for the man, it would be like a sperm analysis. Um, and depending on the outcome of those things, you would then kind of be referred often to gynecology, to a hospital. They tend to like repeat the same things again, because obviously we know with hormones, just getting one single snapshot of them is maybe not necessarily indicative of, suddenly, like, that's a diagnosis or anything. Like, it does sometimes just take time, or it takes a couple of times to repeat it to understand actually what's happening. Um, and then it really just depends on what they find, I suppose. There are other tests that they can do. For example, you can check if for women that whether the ovarian tubes are blocked, for example, and they don't actually like, the egg might be released, but it can't actually get into it can't, like, the sperm can't get to it to fertilize, and then nothing can travel down to the womb either, for example. They do like a dye test with that, where they shoot dye basically through your ovaries to kind of check if it's all there. Um, if they are kind of if there's suspicions maybe of like endometriosis, or kind of like fluid around the ovaries, or whatever, they might order like a laparoscopy, which is actually just the name for keyhole surgery, but it's basically where they go in and actually check, if there's kind of like tissue growing where it shouldn't be growing, or if there's fluid in certain places, or for cysts or anything like that. And unfortunately, that is kind of what women have to go through. Like, it tends to, if the tests don't show anything, then it tends to mean surgery and actually opening you up and looking, what's happening inside. Whereas I suppose for men, yeah, it's just a lot easier in that perspective. They can just provide their sperm sample. Obviously, if there's any issues beforehand, that sperm is not produced in a way, or not enough, or whatever, then obviously there might be some sort of like surgical interventions to remove sperm, or to look at what's going on. But yeah, it just depends. I think the initial testing seems to be more, or as far as I know, more focused on the woman to start with. But yeah, so these are the kind of tests available, I suppose, and there might be like other tests obviously as well, just depending on people's circumstances. And after that, usually what then happens is that you are referred to something which is called IUI, which is intrauterine insemination. So that's kind of like a previous step to IVF. So where the sperm is inserted at the point of ovulation. So like a fertility clinic would basically help to kind of track your ovulation, and then the sperm is inserted, and then hopefully sperm and egg meet and they fertilize and you fall pregnant. And after so and so many cycle of that, if that fails again, then you would kind of be referred to IVF, which is then just a more kind of more lengthy process, I suppose. But this is kind of like the um yeah, these are kind of like the usual steps I think that happen. Obviously, like every journey, every couple's or every person's journey can be quite different, just depending on where they start. Some people might jump straight to a fertility clinic and just want to pay for certain testing to happen, for example, or want to, go through private testing. Maybe they've done a lot of research online already and they kind of just jump ahead, or like I said, or things might just take a lot longer, or I mean, people sometimes go, depending on what their BMI is, they will go to their GP, they will ask for fertility testing, and they will not get fertility testing because they just get sent away and they would just get told you need to lose weight without any kind of other like investigation into their health or anything like that, which is just a bit shocking, to be quite honest. So there's really various different kind of experiences out there, I suppose. But the first thing is definitely to go to the GP and to ask for fertility testing.
And what criteria, including BMI, do we have to meet if we want to qualify for options such as IVF? And why can this be problematic?
So the BMI is usually the biggest thing. It really depends on where you live. So in Scotland, where I'm based, we're quite lucky that we get access to 3 rounds of IVF funded by the NHS. But in England, it actually depends on the various different health boards, or like the clinical commissioning groups, like CCGs. So it kind of comes down to your postcode sometimes, what the IVF criteria are. So if you're at that stage where you are considering that, then I think that's probably the first thing you really need to look up, is what the IVF criteria are for your individual postcode. Sometimes the BMI is 30, sometimes they're looking for below 30. I've come across cases where there was people where clinics were asking for a BMI of 27. And then like usually if it's private, then it's kind of a BMI of 35. There might be other criteria such as, well, there definitely will be other criteria such as that you can't smoke. You need to like not be smoking at all. Once you sign the paperwork for IVF, it does specifically say that you should stop drinking alcohol as well. They don't test for the alcohol, but with the smoking, I think sometimes they actually test. I think they can test it through like a little thing that you blow into, basically, whether you're smoking or not. And apart from that, it's probably more in relation to whether the couple or one of the people in the couple has already had children. So at the moment, the guidelines still say that if you already have children from a previous relationship, then for example, you're not eligible for funded treatment. You would have to pay for it yourself. I think they're about to change that. But well, just depends if the new government still agrees, I suppose. And then there's also like considerations, I suppose, for lesbian couples as well, because so far they had to go through multiple rounds of IUI, so like the kind of pre-step to IVF, self-funded, like they would have to basically to prove that they're infertile. Right. And then they would only be able to be referred to IVF, for example. Whereas I think they kind of reduce that now, that I think you only have to, you can do less rounds of IUI basically before you can jump to IVF. Again, this was all part of like the kind of health, or in the health kind of agenda like a few months ago, but it just depends, I suppose, of whether they're actually going to implement that. But and then I suppose when it would actually come into force, I'm not 100% sure. So yeah, if somebody is kind of thinking about IVF, then that's the first thing to do. Check what your local guidelines are basically, and go through them, and kind of the BMI, I suppose, is the most it's kind of tricky criteria of it, because it's kind of debated whether the BMI really has that much of an impact on the actual IVF treatment. So a lot of the guidelines that you see is more in relation to the BMI having an impact on the pregnancy and again development of the child, but maybe not so much directly on the actual success of an IVF treatment. And I think a lot of people kind of debate and kind of say like, well, but why is my chance of even trying to even create an embryo kind of prevented at this stage when it actually only like impacts on pregnancy? But it depends. I think there's like financial aspects part of it as well from the NHS point of view, because I think basically you would require higher dosages of injection medication, like medication for the IVF treatment, and obviously that comes with, it costs a lot more money to then fund it. So I think there's a reason why the BMI requirement is kind of there. But also I suppose the tricky thing from the NHS perspective, I suppose, is also you can't really assess body composition. And every coach that listens to this will know how hard it is. Like, you can't just stick everybody through like a DEXA scan or something like that to really understand, is the BMI high because of like excess fat levels? Are we talking visceral fat? Are we talking, subcutaneous fat? All these kind of things. Yeah. So I think from the NHS perspective, it's just like, well, we have a BMI requirement because everybody can measure BMI, everybody can measure your height, everybody can measure your weight, and work out your BMI. But then in my experience, and I've been to 2 different hospitals, and I think my height has been taken by 3 different people, and I've been 3 different heights. So it's not as straightforward, apparently, either, the BMI requirement. So that can be a bit tricky.
Yeah, it's mad. And we all know that like BMI can be flawed, especially in, heavily muscled individuals, for example. And like you also pointed out, where our body fat is stored has an impact on our health. So, someone might carry a lot of body fat, to their midsection, and that might be a little bit more detrimental from a health perspective than someone who distributes their body fat more evenly or carries it in different places. And so it can be flawed, and someone could be in a very healthy body but not meet the BMI requirements. And there's also maybe an argument to be said that like if someone is forced to meet the BMI requirements but sacrifices their relationship with food in order to do so, they might end up going backwards and being in an even worse position from a health perspective at the end of the day.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's where, just saying to somebody, just do a 1,200 calorie diet is just so, so bad, because like, what are you doing? You're basically telling them to just lose weight, but you're not really fixing the issue that the research is currently telling us is then impacting them. So because as soon as the person then falls pregnant, they're just going to go back to just basically eating, like the way they have always have, I mean, and probably even maybe like even worse, just because like first trimester, like food and diet can be really tricky to start with anyway, and if it's just a continuation from that, like it's just never going to get better. So yeah, I really sometimes don't understand why when they have well, I know again it's like it's probably finances and funding, but when you stipulate a BMI requirement to then not also offer appropriate help for somebody to actually get through this, I just don't get it. And I get really kind of like passionate about it just because I speak to so many women in this situation, and even though they have been referred to NHS weight management or something like that, but then it's like another 12-month waiting list, or they get to see somebody for half an hour. Like we all know as coaches, like that's just not enough. And there is actually research there that tells us that a more moderate calorie deficit that is supported ideally for 6 months through like some sort of coaching is what is useful in that respect, to reduce your weight. And I just don't really, I just wish they would take that into consideration basically. And also, like we said earlier about the how age does matter, just sending somebody, I suppose the consideration of just sending somebody away for 2 years to kind of lose enough fat because their BMI might be 40 or above, and probably will take quite a considerable of time to lose that weight. I think like when there's no like really hard and fast evidence to say 100% BMI impacts on the success of IVF. So I'm not talking pregnancy, like totally appreciate that, but to kind of refuse somebody the chance to just create embryos, I think is a bit too harsh in my opinion.
Yeah, definitely. And so if someone, obviously we can't do anything about the BMI
No.
requirements. So if someone has to make these requirements to get IVF, what should they take into account when they're considering their approach to doing that?
I think it's a tricky one because, again, I think it really depends. Like, people, for example, come to me at various different stages. Like, some people might come to me and say, I have so fertility surgery, so for like a laparoscopy, for example, and my BMI needs to be below 35 for that. So sometimes even for the fertility testing, like I said, like there might be a BMI requirement already there. And then you only have 3 months. And obviously you're not going to say, and they've maybe already waited like 6 months to 12 months to even get this appointment. So I'm not going to say to them, well, no, I'm not going to help you. You just figure it out yourself. And they'll probably just go away and just try and like dehydrate their body or something like that for 2 days, and or go keto or something like that. You know what I mean? Like, because that's literally what happens. Like, when I look at like IVF groups or fertility groups, the amount of people that just say, "Oh, just take some laxatives and you'll be fine," is honestly shocking. So I think from a coaching perspective, I think trying to meet the client where you can and just to try and make it as healthy as possible, the weight loss, I think is kind of the agenda, I suppose. And like I said, if somebody only has like 3 months or so, like kind of like a few weeks, obviously you can kind of do quite a lot. Again, like I don't think in any situation you really need a 1,200 calorie deficit, but you might have to be prepared as a coach to maybe do something a little bit more below moderate, I suppose, to help your client, and then just be there for them, support them like emotionally, obviously, and and be kind of empathetic to the situation. If somebody comes to you obviously 12 months out, fantastic, because then you've got time to kind of like really teach them quite a lot about nutrition and like balanced eating and kind of mindset, all of these kind of things. But yeah, so I think it really depends on when I suppose when they come to you. But as an individual, if you have time, then I would definitely recommend really sitting down and trying to think about why you overeat, or why you are in the situation that you have excess body fat. Is it just a habit of that you just you just tend to eat from a bigger plate or something like that, or is it actually your emotional eating, for example? And if it's your emotional eating, then you will need to take time to address that first, in my opinion, if you have the time. Again, if you have a coach, then if you have a good coach, then you might be able to kind of do it at the same time, if time is an issue, for example, where you can kind of work on your emotional eating and also lose the weight that you need to, if you have like a specific appointment for you, for example. But I think in general, it's really about sussing out what the issue is to start with, and then addressing it, and if you need help, to ask for that help. And like, I think it brings me back to like going back to a little bit on supplements, where I kind of get a bit frustrated that people are quite happy to spend hundreds and hundreds of pounds on supplements when they would actually just invest in coaching that would have a bigger impact. And it sounds like, obviously coming from a coach, it sounds like, oh well, you're just trying to sell coaching, but that is genuinely not what it is. Like, I got a coach as well when last year, to help myself, because it is just different, and getting that help from somebody else is just so much better. So yeah, identify what the problem is, and then don't be afraid to ask for help. That's what I would say.
Yeah, amazing. I have really enjoyed having you as a guest, Alessia. It's been amazing. And I think that so many people will really enjoy and benefit from listening to this podcast. Where can people find you on social media? Where can they inquire about your services and all of that sort of thing?
So I'm mainly on Instagram. So it's just AW nutrition _ where you can find me.
Cool. For anyone listening, I will put Alessia's information in the bio down below. So don't hesitate to get in touch with her. Make sure that you give her a follow. And as always, thank you so much for listening. It has been an absolute pleasure. And I will see you in the next one.
Thank you.